A woman can survive a loveless marriage, but the moment she hears herself described as a burden, something inside her quietly stops asking to be loved. The sentence came through the half-open door of the smoking room at Langford House with the softness of silk and the cruelty of winter steel. Evelyn Hartwell stood in the dim corridor, both hands steady around the silver tea tray, while the Atlantic wind pressed fog against the tall windows behind her. Inside the room, Duke Everett Langford laughed with three gentlemen whose voices smelled of brandy, old money, and inherited certainty. "I'll endure her until she gives me a son," he said, as if speaking of bad weather, a dull sermon, or an uncomfortable chair that must be tolerated until replaced. "After that, Langford will be secure, and my duty will be finished." No one saw Evelyn. No one heard the small silence that passed through her body. The tray did not fall. The cups did not tremble. Even the spoon resting beside the sugar bowl remained exactly where it was, shining beneath the corridor lamp like a little moon that had learned not to cry. She had been Duchess of Langford for 8 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. In that time she had learned the map of the house better than she had learned the shape of her husband's heart. Langford House stood on a grey cliff above the Maine coast, all stone, iron, and narrow windows, with the sea nearly 100 feet below striking the rocks as if trying to break the estate loose from its own history. By day, Evelyn managed its servants, its letters, its cold dining room, its ledgers, its flowers, its endless rituals of dignity. By night, she slept beneath a painted ceiling in a room where the fireplace was always lit, yet the air never grew warm. Everett had never been openly cruel to her. That had been the terrible part. Cruelty would have given her something to resist. Instead, he had offered courtesy without tenderness, protection without closeness, and a title without a home. He rose when she entered. He bowed when she departed. He addressed her as "my Duchess," in public, and "Evelyn," only when duty required it. At dinner, he asked whether she found the soup acceptable. At breakfast, he read the financial papers. At night, when the household settled and the fog curled over the gardens, he became a shadow moving behind the wall that marriage had built between them. Inside the smoking room, Lord Whitcomb, Everett's uncle, gave a low approving chuckle. "Spoken like a Langford. Sentiment ruins a house faster than debt." Another man murmured, "The girl is pretty enough. Quiet, too. You were fortunate." Evelyn's fingers tightened once around the tray handle, then loosened. Pretty enough. Quiet. Fortunate. 3 words, and somehow they erased every hour she had spent making this house less haunted. The orange blossoms in the conservatory. The repaired curtains in the east parlor. The warm meals sent to the stable boys during the first frost. The letters she wrote in Everett's name to tenants whose roofs had leaked after the September storm. None of it mattered. She was not a wife. She was a waiting room for a son. A clock in satin. A name in the family Bible, useful only when followed by the word heir. She turned from the door without a sound and placed the untouched tea tray on a narrow walnut table beneath the portrait of Everett's mother. The painted woman looked down with pale hands folded in her lap, her expression so calm it almost seemed like warning. Evelyn met those painted eyes for one long breath. Then she reached for the wedding ring on her finger. She did not remove it. Not yet. Instead, she covered it with her other hand, as if shielding a wound no one had earned the right to see. Behind her, Everett laughed again, but this time the sound no longer entered her heart. It struck the outside of something newly closed. Slowly, Evelyn walked down the corridor toward the grand staircase, her white evening gown brushing the dark carpet like mist over water. A footman stepped aside and bowed. She gave him the same gentle nod she always gave, because dignity was the last possession no one could take unless she handed it over. At the landing, the house opened beneath her, vast and candlelit, beautiful in the way a mausoleum could be beautiful. The sea wind moaned under the doors. Somewhere far below, waves shattered themselves against stone. Evelyn paused with one hand on the banister and looked toward the west wing, where her husband would later expect to find her seated in the blue drawing-room, composed, obedient, and available to be endured. For the first time since her wedding day, she did not go there. She turned east instead, toward the unused tower rooms that smelled of dust, salt, and old rain. With each step, her breath steadied. With each step, something fragile in her stopped breaking and began to harden into shape. She would not accuse him. She would not beg him to take back what he had said. Words spoken in laughter were often the truest ones men allowed themselves to say. By the time Everett Langford left the smoking room an hour later, he would find the tea cold, the corridor empty, and his wife gone from every place he had carelessly assumed she would remain. The East Tower had not been prepared for a duchess. That was the first thing Evelyn noticed when Mrs. Marlowe, the housekeeper, unlocked the narrow door with visible discomfort and lifted the lamp into the dark room. The chamber smelled faintly of salt, cedar, and years of being forgotten. A white sheet covered the bed. Another draped the small writing desk by the window. Dust silvered the mantel like old snow, and beyond the glass the Atlantic heaved beneath a moonless sky, black and restless nearly 100 feet below the cliff. "Your Grace," Mrs. Marlowe said carefully, "I can have the blue room warmed again at once. His Grace will surely expect—" She stopped, because Evelyn had turned to face her with a gentleness that made argument impossible. "I will sleep here tonight." Mrs. Marlowe lowered her eyes. She had served Langford House since Everett was a boy, and loyalty had taught her when to speak and when to protect silence. "Then I shall send fresh linens and a fire." "Thank you." Evelyn removed her gloves finger by finger, slowly, as though each small motion required ceremony. The ring remained on her left hand, bright against skin gone pale from the corridor chill. She looked at it once, not with hatred, but with the tired curiosity one gives an object that has failed to become what it promised. Downstairs, the men would finish their cigars. The glasses would be cleared. The lamps would be lowered. Everett would pass through the hall with his composed step and perhaps glance toward the blue drawing-room where she usually waited with a book open in her lap, not reading, only performing the soft patience expected of a wife. She wondered how long it would take him to notice her absence. 10 minutes. An hour. A week. The thought did not wound her as deeply as it should have. Perhaps the heart, when struck too precisely, went numb before it bled. While the maid stripped the sheets and stirred life into the cold hearth, Evelyn stood at the tower window and let memory come to her without permission. 8 months earlier, she had arrived at Langford House beneath a pale spring rain, her wedding veil pinned beneath a pearl comb that had belonged to her mother. Her father had been dead 6 months then, leaving behind debts, a respectable name, and a house in Portland that creditors circled like gulls above a storm-tossed deck. Everett Langford had offered marriage with flawless courtesy. No tenderness. No deception. A union of necessity, drawn by lawyers, approved by relatives, sealed in a church where the sea wind rattled the stained glass. She had told herself that affection might grow in quiet soil. She had believed duty could become kindness, and kindness could become something warmer. On their wedding morning, Everett had stood beside her like a carved figure in black wool, handsome, solemn, unreachable. When he placed the ring on her finger, his hand had been steady. Hers had not. "I will honor you as Duchess of Langford," he had said later in the carriage, his gaze fixed beyond the rain-streaked window. At the time, she had mistaken honor for hope. Now she understood the difference. Honor could open doors, send servants, pay bills, and protect a name. Honor could not make a woman feel seen across a breakfast table. It could not soften the silence after dinner. It could not warm the space between two people who shared a house but not a life. The maid finished laying fresh sheets and left with a curtsy, closing the door so softly it sounded like mercy. Alone at last, Evelyn crossed to the writing desk and pulled the sheet away. Dust rose in the lamplight. She found paper in the drawer, yellowed but usable, and took up a pen. For several moments, she wrote nothing. Then, in small careful letters, she addressed the page to her mother, as she had done since girlhood whenever grief became too private to survive unspoken. "Dear Mama, tonight I learned the exact shape of my place in this house." Her hand paused. The fire cracked behind her. The sea answered below. She did not write the sentence she had heard. Not yet. To write it would make it permanent, and some wounds needed 1 hour of darkness before they could bear ink. Instead, she folded the blank half of the page beneath her palm and listened to the tower breathe around her. Far away, a door opened in the west wing. Footsteps crossed the lower hall, measured and familiar. Then they stopped. For the first time in months, Duke Everett Langford had entered the blue drawing-room and found no wife waiting in the lamplight. Everett did not ask where she had gone. At least, not at first. He stood in the doorway of the blue drawing-room with one hand still resting on the brass handle, looking at the empty chair near the fire as though the furniture had failed him by not containing her. The book Evelyn had carried for 3 weeks lay closed on the small table, a blue ribbon marking a page she had never turned. Beside it sat the embroidery basket she used in the evenings, the needle fixed neatly in a square of white linen, the thread cut and tied off with the careful discipline that seemed to govern everything she touched. Nothing was disordered. Nothing was dramatic. That was what unsettled him. A scene of anger would have been easier to understand. A shattered cup. A slammed door. A letter left upon the mantel. Instead, the room held only absence, quiet and precise, the way winter entered a house through a crack too small to see. "Has Her Grace retired?" he asked the footman stationed near the hall. The young man straightened. "Yes, Your Grace." Everett waited. The footman swallowed. "To the East Tower, Your Grace." For one brief second, something moved. Across the Duke's face, not surprise exactly, but the first narrow shadow of consequence. "The East Tower is not in use. Mrs. Marlowe had it made ready at Her Grace's request." Everett said nothing. The house breathed around him. From the corridor came the distant tick of the grandfather clock, each second falling with unnecessary clarity. In the smoking room, his uncle's laughter still lingered in the air of memory, along with his own words, spoken too loudly, too easily, too late to call back. He had said them for an audience. That was the excuse his pride offered. Men like Lord Wickham respected hardness. They trusted a duke who treated marriage like land, heirs like currency, sentiment like rot beneath polished floors. Everett had learned long ago that if a man did not wear coldness convincingly, others would carve into him until they found something soft enough to use. So he had laughed. He had made his wife small in front of men who would have mocked him for making her precious. He told himself that intention mattered. He had not meant for Evelyn to hear. Yet, as he crossed the hall and saw the abandoned tea tray beneath his mother's portrait, the lie weakened. Whether she had heard or not, the words had existed. They had been born from his mouth and carried his name. That was enough. He stopped before the tray. The tea had gone cold. A thin skin trembled on the surface of the cups, touched by the draught beneath the door. His mother's painted gaze looked past him with the same pale patience she had worn in life. He remembered her hands cutting orange blossoms in the old glasshouse. He remembered his father saying that a Langford wife must understand duty before affection. He remembered, most clearly, the day his older brother Thomas was lost at sea, and how the household had changed overnight from a home into a monument. Thomas had been the golden son, the easy laugh, the promised heir. Everett had been the spare, raised in the shadow of expectations that were never meant to land upon him. Then the telegram came. The fishing vessel found wreckage 20 miles off the coast. No bodies recovered. No farewell. Only salt, silence, and a title that arrived. Like a sentence. His father had aged 10 years by morning. Lord Wickham had arrived by noon. The line must be secured, his uncle had said while the women wept upstairs. Grief is private. Inheritance is not. Everett had been 26 then. Old enough to obey. Young enough to believe obedience could keep the house from falling into ruin. Years later, when Evelyn Hartwell entered his life with her quiet manners and clear gray eyes, he had seen danger where others saw convenience. She did not flatter. She did not chase. She moved through Langford House as if listening to every wounded thing inside it. Within a month, servants smiled more readily. Within 2, the tenants spoke her name with warmth. Within 3, Everett began taking longer routes through the house just to pass a room where she might be standing by a window, arranging flowers as if light could be persuaded to stay. That had frightened him more than any debt, any scandal, any storm rolling in from the Atlantic. Love had ruined his mother with waiting. Love had driven his father into bitterness. Love had turned Thomas into a saint no living man could equal. Everett had decided he would give Evelyn respect, security, and the name of Duchess. He would not give her the power to destroy him. In the east tower above, a light appeared in one narrow window. Small. Steady. Far from him. Everett looked up through the darkened stairwell and felt, for the first time since his wedding day, that his wife had not moved into another room. She had moved beyond his reach. By morning, the whole of Langford House understood that something had changed, though no one dared give the change a name. Servants moved more softly than usual through the stone corridors, carrying coal scuttles, folded linens, and breakfast trays with the solemn care of people handling glass. Mrs. Marlowe supervised the polishing of the silver in the dining room, but her eyes kept drifting toward the empty chair at the far end of the table, where the Duchess had always sat with her back straight, her tea untouched until the Duke lifted his own cup. At 8 o'clock, Everett entered in a dark morning coat, freshly shaved, composed to the last button. He paused only half a step when he saw one place setting instead of two. "Her Grace will not be joining me?" he asked. Mrs. Marlowe folded her hands. "Her Grace requested a tray in the east tower, Your Grace." Everett looked toward the tall windows, where fog blurred the cliff path and turned the gardens into pale shadows. "Did she say why?" "No, Your Grace." A lesser woman might have sent a message sharpened with accusation. Evelyn sent marmalade back untouched and asked for more writing paper. Everett sat alone at the long table, while the footman poured coffee into a cup that sounded too loud against the saucer. Across from him, the empty chair became an answer he had not requested. He opened the newspaper. He read the same line 4 times. By noon, Evelyn had done what Everett would later understand as the first act of her quiet rebellion. She sent for the head gardener and discussed the winter covering of the rose beds. She approved the weekly accounts. She visited the laundry room to ask whether the new girl from Ellsworth had enough warm stockings. She wrote 2 letters on estate business in her careful hand, signed them as Duchess of Langford, and had them delivered through the proper channels. Nothing in her conduct suggested hysteria. Nothing suggested wounded pride. That was the brilliance and the cruelty of it. She performed every duty attached to his name, and withdrew herself from every tenderness he had mistaken for obligation. At luncheon, she did not appear. At tea, the blue drawing-room remained unlit. By evening, the bowl of orange blossoms that had stood every week in the library had been removed, leaving a pale circle on the polished table where the vase had kept the wood from fading. Everett stood before that empty circle longer than he intended. Those flowers had come from the old glasshouse, the one place in Langford House that still held his mother's memory without bitterness. Evelyn had restored it quietly in June, replacing cracked panes, trimming the citrus trees, coaxing fragrance from branches he had not visited in years. He had noticed. Of course he had noticed. He had simply said nothing, because gratitude felt dangerously close to need. That night, when dinner was served, Evelyn entered the dining room at the exact stroke of 7. Everett rose at once. For one brief, foolish moment, relief passed through him so sharply it almost hurt. She wore a high-necked gown of soft gray silk, her hair pinned with pearl combs, her face calm enough to shame the sea. She curtsied with perfect grace. "Your Grace." Not Everett. Not my lord, spoken gently as she sometimes did when no one was near. "Your Grace." A title placed between them like a closed gate. "Evelyn," he said. Her eyes lifted to his. Clear. Polite. Unavailable. They sat. The soup was served. The fire burned low in the marble hearth. For several minutes, only the silver spoke. Everett searched for some suitable sentence, and found himself, absurdly, afraid of his own wife. "I understand you have moved to the East Tower." "Yes. It is draughty." I have known colder rooms. His hand still beside the wineglass. The answer had been quiet, not bitter, and that made it worse. If the blue room displeased you, another chamber could have been prepared. Evelyn looked down at her plate. The blue room did not displease me. I merely realized I had no reason to remain there. The words entered him slowly. No reason. Not anger. Not punishment. A conclusion. He wanted to say that she had misunderstood him, though he knew she had not. He wanted to explain the old pressure of his uncle, the dead weight of lineage, the terror of wanting what could be taken away. But explanation, offered too soon, would sound like defense, and defense would be another injury. Across the table, Evelyn lifted her spoon with steady fingers. The candlelight touched the ring still on her hand. Everett saw it and breathed more easily for 1 second, until he understood that she wore it not as surrender, but as discipline. She would not disgrace his house. She would not abandon her duties. She would simply stop offering him the unseen gifts he had never thanked her for. After dinner, she rose before he could ask her to stay. Good night, Your Grace. He stood as she left. Her skirts whispered across the floor, softer than farewell. When the door closed behind her, Everett remained beside the table, surrounded by crystal, candles, and all the noble silence he had spent his life perfecting. For the first time, it sounded exactly like loneliness. The winter supper at Langford House had been planned before Evelyn moved to the East Tower, and because she had been raised to understand that dignity was most necessary when the heart wished to disappear, she did not cancel it. By 6 o'clock, carriages began arriving through the coastal fog, their lanterns bobbing along the cliff road like small uncertain stars. The guests came wrapped in fur collars, velvet capes, and the satisfied curiosity of people who sensed trouble behind polished doors. Evelyn received them in the great hall beneath the chandelier, wearing ivory silk and her mother's pearls, every inch the Duchess of Langford. If her smile was quieter than usual, it was no less graceful. If her hand felt cold inside her glove, no one had earned the truth of it. Everett stood beside her, close enough for propriety, distant enough for history. Each time he heard her addressed as Your Grace, he felt the title strike differently than before. It no longer sounded like honor bestowed upon her. It sounded like armor she had been forced to wear in his house. Lord Whitcomb arrived last, broad, silver-haired, and cheerful in the way of men who had never doubted their right to speak. He kissed Evelyn's gloved hand with theatrical warmth. My dear Duchess, you look remarkably well. Marriage agrees with you, though one hopes it will soon agree with the family line as well. Evelyn's fingers remained still in his grasp. Everett's jaw tightened, but the words had already entered the room, carried by the attentive silence of guests who pretended not to listen. Uncle, Everett said low. Lord Whitcomb only smiled. Come now, no shame in expectation. A great house must look forward. Evelyn withdrew her hand gently. Then it should be careful not to trip over what stands before it. The sentence was soft. Too soft to be called disrespectful. Sharp enough to turn several heads. Dinner began beneath painted ceilings and the long shadows of candles. The Atlantic wind rattled the tall windows at intervals, as if the sea itself wished to be admitted. The table gleamed with crystal, silver, white roses, and all the careful beauty Evelyn had arranged before her heart changed its address. She sat opposite Everett, calm as a portrait, while courses appeared and vanished. Oyster stew. Roasted winter vegetables. Salmon with lemon cream. Apple tart dusted in sugar. The food was praised. The weather was discussed. Politics were avoided. Then Lady Marston, who had spent the evening watching Evelyn with the bright eyes of a hawk, leaned slightly forward. You are very brave, Duchess, to host so soon after settling into married life. Many young wives would prefer privacy during such a delicate season. Evelyn placed her glass down with barely a sound. Privacy is useful. So is fresh air. A faint ripple of laughter moved around the table, uncertain and quickly swallowed. Lord Whitcomb raised his wine. Fresh air will not preserve a dukedom, I fear. Sons do that. Everett set his fork down. Enough. It was the first command he had spoken all evening that sounded less like habit than warning. But Lady Marston, encouraged by the old man's boldness and her own appetite for discomfort, gave a delicate sigh. Families do grow anxious, Your Grace. Especially when a title is so old. A woman in your position must feel such responsibility. Evelyn looked at her directly. The candles reflected in her gray eyes, steady and bright. A woman cannot be replaced from a place she was never allowed to occupy. The silence that followed did not fall. It froze. Across the table, Everett stopped breathing for one measured second. Lord Whitcomb stared as though a marble statue had opened its eyes. Lady Marston's smile remained, but only because it had nowhere else to go. Evelyn did not blush. She did not apologize. She lifted her water glass and took one small sip, as if she had merely commented on the weather. Everett saw then what he had refused to see for months. His wife was not fragile. She was wounded with precision, and still she sat straighter than every person who had helped wound her. Something hot and unfamiliar moved beneath his ribs, not anger at her, never at her, but at the room, at his uncle, at himself most of all. He had believed silence protected a house from scandal. Now he understood that silence could also become the room where cruelty learned to speak freely. The Duchess of Langford, Everett said, his voice carrying to every corner of the table, has honored this family with more grace than it has yet deserved. Evelyn's eyes flicked to him, startled for the first time that night. Lord Whitcomb's face darkened. Everett, sentiment at dinner is unbecoming. Then let us call it truth. The words left him before pride could soften them. No one moved. Outside, the fog pressed its pale face against the glass. Evelyn looked away first, and that small withdrawal hurt Everett more than any rebuke could have. His defense had come. Yes. But late. Late enough that she had learned to defend herself. When the ladies rose after dinner, Evelyn passed behind his chair without touching it, without pausing, without offering the faint warmth that had once lived in her nearness. The scent of orange blossom moved with her, and was gone. Everett remained seated among men, wine, and inheritance, staring at the empty doorway through which his wife had disappeared. For years he had feared that loving someone would make him weak. That night, before a table full of witnesses, he discovered the far greater weakness was needing forgiveness from a woman too dignified to ask him for anything at all. The last guest departed shortly after midnight, leaving behind the faint perfume of roses, cold ashes in the drawing-room hearth, and the kind of silence that follows a wound no one has dared to name. Everett stood at the base of the grand staircase while the servants carried away glasses and folded napkins with careful efficiency. Above him, the east tower remained lit. One small square of gold in a house of dark windows. Evelyn had gone there after bidding farewell to their guests with flawless composure, accepting compliments, returning courtesies, and vanishing before he could find a single private word that did not sound too late. He told himself not to follow her. A gentleman did not force conversation upon a wife who had withdrawn with such deliberate grace. A duke did not climb narrow stairs in the middle of the night because one sentence at dinner had revealed the poverty of his own courage. Yet long after the household quieted, Everett found himself outside the east tower door with a lamp in one hand and no excuse strong enough to justify the weakness in his chest. He lifted his knuckles. Before he could knock, he heard a soft scrape within, the sound of a chair pushed back, followed by paper rustling. The door had not been fully latched. It stood open by less than an inch. Through the narrow space, he saw Evelyn at the small writing desk near the window, her hair loosened from its pins and falling in pale waves over the shoulders of her gray wrapper. The fire behind her had burned low. The Atlantic beyond the glass was invisible, but its voice filled the room, endless and hollow. Everett should have stepped away. Instead, his eyes fell upon the folded pages resting beside her hand. He recognized the steady slant of her writing from estate letters, from household accounts, from the notes she left for Mrs. Marlowe about winter blankets and pantry stores. Evelyn dipped her pen and continued, unaware that he stood beyond the door like a man listening at the edge of his own judgment. Dear Mamma, she wrote softly as she formed the words, her lips moving because she believed herself alone. "I think I have finally understood the difference between being chosen and being accepted as useful. A chosen woman is looked for in a room. A useful woman is noticed only when she is missing from her place." Everett's fingers tightened around the lamp handle. The flame trembled. Inside, Evelyn paused, not because she had heard him, but because the next sentence seemed to cost her. "I do not hate him. That would be easier. Hatred gives the heart a wall to lean on. What I feel is stranger. I pity the boy he must have been before everyone taught him that tenderness was a danger to his name." Everett closed his eyes. The words struck more deeply for being merciful. She had every right to make him a villain on the page. Instead, she had tried to understand him, and that kindness humiliated him more than accusation. Evelyn turned the paper slightly and continued. "But pity is not a marriage. Duty is not tenderness. A house may call me Duchess, but at night I am still a woman wondering whether my child, if I am ever given one, will be loved for being a son while I remain merely the passage by which he arrived. I am ashamed to write that. I am more ashamed that it feels true." Everett stepped back as if the floor beneath him had shifted. No scandal, no debt, no political enemy had ever made him feel so completely undone. He had feared becoming vulnerable to love. He had never considered that in protecting himself, he had made the person nearest to him feel less human than an inheritance. A log settled in the fire. Evelyn lifted her head toward the door. Everett moved away quickly, retreating down the narrow corridor before she could see him. He reached the landing and stopped beneath the narrow tower window, breathing as though he had walked miles through snow. Below, Langford House slept, magnificent and obedient, every portrait straight, every lock polished, every family name preserved in gilt frames. For generations, men had guarded this place by asking women to endure what pride refused to examine. His mother had endured silence. His grandmother had endured duty. Now Evelyn, who had entered his house with clear eyes and quiet hope, had begun to endure him. The thought was unbearable because it was exact. Everett went to his study, not to drink, not to work, but to unlock the drawer where he kept the old family Bible. The Langford births were recorded in dark ink across brittle pages. Sons underlined. Daughters written smaller. Marriages noted beside dowries, alliances, estates gained, fortunes secured. He turned to the newest page. His own name waited there beside Evelyn's, the line beneath them blank, expectant, accusing. For the first time, Everett did not see an empty space for an heir. He saw the shape of a woman he had asked to vanish into it. Dawn found him still seated at the desk, the Bible open before him and the lamp burned nearly dry. When the first gray light entered from the sea, he took a clean sheet of paper and wrote one sentence, slowly, without title. Command or excuse. Evelyn, I have heard enough of your silence to know that I am the one who should have been listening. By late afternoon, the storm that had been gathering beyond the horizon finally reached Langford House. It came first as a darkening of the sea, then as a low shudder through the windows, then as rain striking the cliffside glass with the sharp insistence of thrown gravel. Servants hurried along the corridors to fasten shutters and carry in firewood, while Mrs. Marlowe ordered lamps lit before the hour required them. Evelyn remained in the east tower with Everett's note resting unopened on her writing desk. She had seen his handwriting. She had known at once that it was his. For nearly an hour, she had stood before it, one hand pressed lightly to the back of the chair, unable to decide whether reading it would heal something or only teach the wound a new shape. In the end, she left it sealed. Some apologies deserved daylight. Some pain needed the shelter of one more night. Near dusk, as the wind rose to a mournful howl, a footman came with news that made her turn from the window. A lower pane in the old glasshouse had cracked under the gale, and water was coming in near the orange trees. Evelyn felt the words before she answered them. The orange trees. Everett's mother had planted them years ago, delicate stubborn things that should never have survived a Maine winter, yet somehow did, protected by glass, coal heat, and memory. Evelyn had not restored the glasshouse for herself. She had restored it because the first time she mentioned Lady Langford, Everett's face had changed in a way so brief most would have missed it. A flicker. A bruise beneath composure. "Tell Mr. Hale to cover the roots with canvas and bring extra lanterns," she said, already reaching for her cloak. "Your Grace, the wind is dangerous," the footman protested. "Then we shall move quickly." The path from the east door to the glasshouse ran along the inner garden wall, nearly 200 yards through rain, gravel, and the scent of salt blown hard from the sea. Evelyn kept her hood low and one hand against the stone as she made her way forward. The glasshouse loomed ahead, its iron ribs dark against the storm, a fragile palace of panes and shadows. Inside, lantern light shook over wet floors. Mr. Hale and 2 gardeners struggled to tie canvas around the planters while rain slipped through the broken pane in silver streams. "The upper vent has jammed," Mr. Hale shouted above the wind. "If it tears loose, the whole south side may go." Evelyn looked up. The vent shuddered in its frame, metal hinge groaning, a narrow mouth opening and closing to the storm. The nearest ladder stood already braced against the inner wall. "I can reach the latch," she said. "Absolutely not, Your Grace." But she was already moving, gathering her skirts with one hand and climbing carefully, rung by rung, the wet wood cold beneath her palms. She did not think of heroics. She thought only of orange blossoms in June, of a boy who had lost his mother, of a man who had forgotten that grief could be tended instead of buried. The latch resisted. She pressed harder. Wind struck the glasshouse with a force that made every pane tremble. Below, someone called her name. "Not Duchess. Not Your Grace. Evelyn." The voice tore through the storm, raw with fear. She turned her head and saw Everett standing at the entrance, rain darkening his coat, his hair wind-tossed, his face stripped of every careful mask. In that instant, the latch gave way. The vent slammed shut, and Evelyn descended too quickly, one foot slipping on the lower rung. She caught herself against the frame, not falling, but scraping her gloved palm against the sharp edge of old metal. Pain flashed clean and bright through her hand. She reached the floor with her breath caught and her glove torn, a thin red line showing through the wet white fabric. No one moved for 1 second. Then Everett crossed the glasshouse faster than dignity allowed. "Evelyn!" He took her hand with a gentleness that seemed to frighten him as much as her. "You are hurt." She looked at his bent head, at the rain on his shoulders, at the panic he had arrived too late to hide. The sight might have undone her yesterday. Tonight, it only made her tired. "It is a small cut. You should not have come out in this weather." Her eyes lifted to his. "Neither should you." The gardeners withdrew with the delicate instinct of people who knew when a room had become private without becoming empty. Rain continued to thread through the broken lower pane, tapping against the stone floor. Everett wrapped his handkerchief around her palm, his fingers careful, almost reverent. "Why would you risk yourself for this place?" he asked. Evelyn glanced toward the orange trees, their glossy leaves trembling under the lantern light. "Because someone loved them once." His hand stilled around hers. The storm beat against the glass like 1,000 restless hands. For a moment, Everett looked not like a duke, not like the master of Langford House, but like a man standing before the ruins of what he had failed to protect. Evelyn gently withdrew her bandaged hand. "You need not pretend concern, Your Grace. I have endured enough for both of us." The words were quiet. They did not rise above the rain. Still, they struck him with the force of a door closing. Everett looked at her, and whatever answer he had prepared in the long hours before the storm vanished from his face. In its place came something more honest and far more helpless. "I am not pretending," he said. But Evelyn had already turned toward the glasshouse doors, her torn glove held close to her heart, leaving him among the orange trees, the broken glass, and the first undeniable knowledge that love, once wounded, did not return merely because a man had finally learned to speak softly. Everett followed her out of the glasshouse, but not closely enough to claim a right he had not earned. Rain swept across the garden path in pale sheets, bending the winter shrubs and turning the gravel dark beneath their feet. Evelyn walked with her injured hand tucked inside her cloak, her posture straight despite the storm, while he carried the lantern several steps behind her so the light would fall ahead of her rather than on himself. At the east door, Mrs. Marlowe was waiting with towels, a basin of warm water, and the expression of a woman who had prayed for many things but not expected to see any of them answered gently. "Her Grace needs the cut cleaned," Everett said, his voice low. "I will send for Dr. Bell." Evelyn turned at once. "That is not necessary." "It may be. It is a small cut. Small injuries can still be neglected." Her eyes met his, rain clinging to her lashes, and the words found another meaning between them. Everett looked away first. "Then allow Mrs. Marlowe to tend it." In the east tower, the fire had been built high against the weather. Evelyn sat near the hearth while Mrs. Marlowe unwrapped the handkerchief and carefully removed the torn glove. The cut across her palm was shallow, clean, more startling than serious. Everett stood near the door, drenched coat dripping onto the floorboards, his hands closed at his sides as though still restraining himself from reaching for what he had no permission to hold. Mrs. Marlowe cleaned the wound with warm water, dabbed it dry, and wound soft white linen around Evelyn's hand. "There, Your Grace. It should heal nicely if rested." "Thank you." The housekeeper gathered the basin and glanced once at the Duke. He did not move. After a moment, she left them alone, closing the door with the discreet mercy of long service. The storm filled the silence. For a while either spoke. Evelyn looked at the bandage in her lap. Everett looked at the sealed note on her writing desk and understood that even his apology had arrived as another demand upon her strength. "I should not be here if you wished me to leave," he said. "Then why are you still here?" The question was not angry. It was worse. It was honest. Everett drew a breath that seemed to come from a place pride had kept locked for years. "Because I have spent my life leaving every room where tenderness asked something of me. Tonight I am trying to stay." Evelyn did not answer. The firelight touched her face, softening nothing, revealing everything. He took one step forward, then stopped. "I heard part of your letter last night." Her head lifted. For the first time, pain broke through her composure with visible clarity. "You listened at my door?" "Yes." The admission cost him, but he did not soften it with excuses. "I had come to speak with you. The door was open. I should have turned away. I did not. It was dishonorable." Her bandaged hand closed slightly. "Then you know more than I ever intended to give you." "I know less than I deserve to know, and more than I can bear." She looked toward the rain-dark window. "That sounds like a sentence made beautiful so it will not have to be useful." Everett absorbed it. He deserved that. He deserved worse. "You are right." The words were plain, and because they were plain, Evelyn looked back at him. He moved no closer. "I told myself I married you because Langford required an heir. I told myself that keeping distance was a kindness, that you would be safer with respect than with whatever broken thing passed for love in this family. My father taught me that affection made men weak. My uncle taught me that wives were part of inheritance. Loss taught me that anyone I loved would either leave or be taken. So I built a house inside myself where nothing could enter. Then you came here, and without asking, you began lighting rooms I had left dark for years." Evelyn's eyes shone, but no tear fell. "And for that, you punished me with coldness." "Yes." His voice nearly failed, but he held it steady because she deserved truth without ornament. "I did." The fire cracked. The wind pressed hard against the tower. Evelyn looked down at the white linen around her palm. "You asked me for a son with your silence long before you wounded me with your words." Everett closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the Duke of Langford was still standing there in name, but the man beneath the title looked stripped to the bone. "I know." "Do you?" she asked softly. "Because an apology for one sentence is not enough when the whole marriage taught me to expect it." He had no defense. That was the beginning of his repentance. "Then I will not ask you to forgive the sentence. Or the marriage. Or me. I will only ask what I may do tomorrow that harms you less than I did yesterday." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Outside, thunder moved far out over the Atlantic, low and fading. At last, she stood. Everett stepped back at once, giving her room. She crossed to the writing desk, picked up his unopened note, and placed it in the fire without reading it. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished. "Do not write to me like a duke repairing damage," she said. "Speak to me like a man learning the truth." Everett bowed his head. "I will try." "No," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but unshaking. "Try for your tenants. Try for your uncle. Try for your name. With me, either become honest, or leave me in peace." The command was soft. It remade the room. Everett looked at her, and for the first time, he understood that love was not the ache in his chest, nor the fear of losing her, nor the desire to be forgiven. Love was the discipline of not reaching for her until his hands were worthy. He bowed, not as a duke to a duchess, but as a man before the woman he had failed to cherish. Then he left the East Tower and closed the door behind him, carrying no forgiveness, no promise, and no comfort, only the first clean knowledge that repentance had begun exactly where entitlement ended. By the first week of March, Evelyn was no longer living in the East Tower. She was not living in Langford House at all. She had moved 12 miles down the coast to the small white cottage her father had left her near Blue Harbor, a modest place with green shutters, a leaning fence, and a narrow path that led through beach grass to the water. Society called it a separation. Lord Wickham called it disgrace. Mrs. Marlowe, who sent fresh bread twice a week under the excuse of household surplus, called it wisdom. Evelyn called it quiet. For the first time in nearly a year, she woke without listening for footsteps in corridors too grand to comfort her. She boiled her own tea, opened her own windows, and walked the shore when the tide was low, her skirts brushing the sand while gulls cried above the gray Atlantic. Her hand had healed, leaving only a faint pale line across her palm, so slight that no one would notice unless they had once bandaged it with trembling care. Everett did not follow her at once. That restraint became the first gift she believed. He wrote no grand letters, sent no jeweled apology, made no public claim. Instead, he changed the things that had wounded her in silence. Lord Wickham was removed from all estate authority by legal notice, delivered in terms so cold even the old man could not mistake them. The family Bible was returned to its cabinet with the lines for daughters and sons rewritten in equal ink. The tenants received leases signed by both Everett and Evelyn, though she had not asked for such acknowledgement. In the old glasshouse, the broken pane was replaced, and beside the orange trees he placed a small brass plaque bearing his mother's name, not as a shrine to grief, but as proof that love could be remembered without becoming a prison. Evelyn heard of these things through others. She did not go back. Some repentance had to ripen without being harvested too soon. On a late afternoon washed clean after rain, she was cutting rosemary near the cottage gate when she saw him walking up the road from Blue Harbor. No carriage. No crest. No groom behind him. Only Everett Langford in a dark coat damp at the shoulders, carrying his hat in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. He stopped outside the gate as though the latch belonged to a kingdom greater than his own. "Evelyn," he said. "Not Duchess. Not wife." Her name, offered without possession. She set the shears down on the fence post. "Your Grace." Pain moved through his eyes, but he accepted the title as something he had earned. "May I speak?" "You may." He did not open the gate. The sea wind moved between them, smelling of salt, rosemary, and rain-wet earth. "I came to return something. Not to demand that you take it." He opened the wooden box. Inside lay her wedding ring, polished but unchanged, resting on folded linen. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. "I did not know you had it. Mrs. Marlowe found it in the blue room drawer after you left." His voice lowered. "I kept it because I was selfish enough to hope. I brought it because I am trying to become honest enough not to hide behind hope." Evelyn folded her healed hand over the fence rail. "And what do you hope for now?" Everett looked toward the cottage, the small garden, the strip of sea beyond the dunes, as if understanding that this modest place contained more peace than all of Langford House had offered her. I hope to be worthy of visiting again. Nothing more than that unless you choose it. The simplicity of it entered her more deeply than any declaration could have. He continued carefully, each word plain and uncovered. If there is never a son, I will still want your chair across from mine. If there is never a child at all, I will still want your voice in the morning and your flowers in the library only if you wish to place them there. If you never return to Langford House, I will make the road between here and there familiar to my feet. I do not ask you to complete my name. I ask permission to spend whatever years remain learning how to honor yours. Evelyn's eyes stung, not from weakness, but from the strange ache of hearing too late what she had once needed early. Words can be beautiful, Everett. His name changed the air. He heard it, and for one breath, he looked like a man shown mercy he did not deserve. Yes, he said. That is why I no longer trust them alone. He closed the ring box and placed it on the fence posts between them. Keep it. Throw it into the sea. Leave it here until the rain ruins it. I will not decide what it means anymore. Then, with a humility that seemed to cost him everything pride had once protected, Everett stepped back from the gate. He did not kneel in performance. He did not reach for her hand. He simply waited in the open air, a duke with no command left to give. The sun lowered behind the clouds, turning the wet road silver. Evelyn looked at the ring, then at the man beyond the gate, and saw not the end of pain, but the beginning of something pain had made truthful. She lifted the latch. Everett did not move until she opened the gate herself. You may come in from the cold, she said softly. For tea. Nothing more today. His smile was small, broken, and more grateful than joy. Tea is more than I deserve. I know. For the first time, her mouth curved. Not fully. Not forgiveness completed. But enough to let the evening breathe. He followed her up the path, careful to leave space beside her rather than claim it. In the cottage window, lamplight waited, warm and ordinary, touching 2 cups on a wooden table. Behind them, the Atlantic kept breaking against the Maine shore, as it always had, wearing stone down grain by grain until even the hardest things learned softness. Evelyn did not put the ring back on that night. She left it by the rosemary, beneath the clearing sky. But when Everett departed after tea, he found the gate unlatched behind him, and that was enough. Some hearts do not open because they are begged. They open when the one who wounded them finally learns to stand outside without breaking the door.